Welcome to Future Cities Africa. My guest today is Richard Gevers. He's founder of the Open Cities Lab and a non-executive director at Innovate Durban. Richard, welcome. Give us a quick tour of your background.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks so much for having me. So I started out my professional life as an economist, doing quite a lot of work for government, and I spent about 8 years, especially working in sort of econometric modeling and economic modeling around development, with all tiers of government, as in the classic consulting position. And I think through that work, firstly got a lot of sense of the state of development, but also worked quite substantially with municipalities and municipal government. And I started to realize how static and slow our development cycles were, and how you would create a lot of knowledge that would be ultimately produced in a Word document that would sit on a sort of digital shelf or sometimes an actual shelf, gathering dust, only to sort of repeat a similar piece of work a couple of years later when the original work had become out of date. At the same time, I was interested, I think from around 2009, 2010, started to really get interested in data and data science. I think that was an emerging industry at the time, and certainly was always quite keen to understand what more could be done with data and information, especially around cities. At the same time, I had actually my best friend who was at a university in the States doing bioinformatics and engaging with a lot of big data science. And we started to chat about the potential for cities and data. And so that led to the leap. I think I'm mission driven and entrepreneurial. And so the first thing we did was we started a startup around data in cities. And it was actually while I was waiting for him to get here that I started to become aware of the open data movement and civic tech movements globally. And I started what was then called Open Data Durban, which has morphed into Open Cities Lab, as a meetup. I just thought it would be something to get people in Durban talking around data and public interest tech and rights and democracy. But as these things do, things snowballed quite a lot. And, within, I think, 6 to 7 months, we had a constitution and a committee, and it had been decided we needed to be an organization. We're very lucky to get very good support from similar organizations such as Open Up in Cape Town and others. And that opened the door to donor funding. And within less than a year, we were a funded nonprofit working in the space. And that sort of all goes from there.
It's a kind of a fairy tale story that came true. Open Cities Lab is a civic technology lab with a focus on the development of open data for the application of urban challenges operating within cities in Africa. Can you expand on some of the key work being done by the OCL?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, what we've learned over the time, and certainly it's been a journey of making mistakes and really trying to understand how to have impact and doing a lot of things wrong. But we really understand that the work within cities, firstly, is long-term, which is a challenge in political cycles. It's a challenge in donor funding cycles where people are looking for potentially pieces of technology or outputs that look flashy or can, be something to prove impact. But what we really learned is that there's the facets we need to be involved in are empowering citizens, building capacity in government and helping citizens and government meet, and then also building trust and accountability around civic spaces. I think in South Africa specifically, but also Africa with a history of colonialism and apartheid in South Africa, you typically find torn social fabric a lot of social, political, economic factors that drive inequality and segregation, as well as a lot of institutions that need supporting. So that building trust and accountability in civic spaces, especially with the media, with academia, and linkages between those and business and government and citizens, it's really quite a multifaceted, knotty problem. So, I mean, with some of our work, you know, we've invested for quite a while in a platform with South African Cities Network called the South African Cities Open Data Almanac, which is a data platform which offers cities the ability to implement their own instance of a data platform that helps them create an open data portal, but more importantly, create understanding around the use of data information through data stories and dashboards and aligned projects. So, I mean, something around that we've learned is that the supply of data, and I think this was a big movement, I mean, big learning for the open data movement and civic tech movement. The supply of data to consumers, or to citizens, the supply of tech actually doesn't lead to a lot of change without understanding the demand. I mean, it's something that you could probably have, it took a long time to learn, but probably could have anticipated that reams of data available to people without much sense of who's using it for what, or without much sense of anyone knowing what's there, doesn't really lead to much improvement. And so what we've tried to do a lot with the cities we work with, and this project involves a couple of municipalities around the country in South Africa. This project seeks to understand the demand of citizens and citizen groups, and what they might need public information or public government data and connections and context with. Most often people don't know that they need data. Typically they know they need information or guidance or help. And I think often that's the point, is it's not about the data itself, it's about looking at what the changes that they require. Is it about creating economic activity? Is it about accessing information around building access to rights and social development? Is it about understanding the political cycles and how to vote and how to take part in democracy? And then how do you build mechanisms that are both digital and in person to help meet that need? So I think if you look at, for example, edge.durban, which is one of the platforms that has come out of this initiative, the SCOTA initiative, that's really focused around economic development in eThekwini's Edge department, which is part of the economic unit. And the whole idea there is to get out economic information to support businesses, to help them understand where opportunities are, the state of the eThekwinian provincial and national economy, and data related to all sorts of things like business licensing, utilities usage and all that. We're currently part of a very exciting program called Future Cities South Africa. So the Future Cities program and the Prosperity Fund in general is typically aimed at improving mobility, improving access to cities, improving governance, and more recently was able to pivot into supporting COVID-19 support, as well as I think what will be coming up, which is climate change and climate awareness. So within South Africa, this program is happening in 3 cities, Johannesburg, Durban, and Cape Town. We're involved in 2 of these projects. One is building an informal settlement management solution for trying to support the city and partners in improving the state of informal settlement dwellers' lives and building more resilience within the city. And within the city of Cape Town, we're supporting the city on the implementation of their data strategy, which is really exciting. And I think through this, we were able to support both cities as well as Johannesburg on COVID-19 response. And listening to the episode with Craig Kesson, just really been quite blown away by the extent, capability, and dedication of the people within those cities as this crisis emerged. And we felt very honored to be a part of, the data modeling and assisting with data transfer and various different elements of what the cities found themselves in the COVID crisis, which was, real dire situation, lack of funding and support from government above, and having to just deal with building collaborations with provincial government and other sorts of support and civil society to try and improve the situation. In terms of other work, we've typically gone across those three spheres. So with Media Monitoring Africa, we run a program called Dexter. So MMA Dexter is a tool that's been set up by Media Monitoring Africa to enable monitoring of the media for fairness and accountability, enabling us to understand the role of the media in South African politics and the South African sort of conversation, as well as the African situation and conversation, and start to try and improve with the media and like working collaboratively with media houses, try to improve the state of reporting on topics from elections to gender-based violence, care of women and children, political bias within the news. And this sort of ties into a growing initiative that we're a part of now, which is starting to look at how to support media in reporting on the COVID crisis, health crisis, and build better information pipelines and data around health, post-COVID recovery, vaccines, and all these sorts of things across the continent. And so recently OCL has started to work more predominantly in Nigeria and Kenya with partners, and we're starting to expand our programs and our interests to cities on the continent. Alongside some of the other ideas, just to bring some forward, we, with Violence Protection to Urban Upgrading, VPUU, we've built a platform called Check It, which is all around trying to connect citizens to government and allowing for citizens to monitor the states of wash facilities and informal settlements, and then positively collaborate with governments to do everything from getting these facilities improved, but also key things like changing metrics from taps installed to taps working, for example, so that what the city measures actually helps them provide better services to the residents and builds that kind of trust. We've worked with National Treasury on a open data for cities toolkit and program called Intact. And what this does is it tries to present a number of resources. It doesn't try to, it presents a number of resources to enable smart governance and open data mechanisms for cities. And I think that's an important thing that is often within the smart cities conversation, is that what do we want a smart city to be? Like for us, it can be as simple as people that are residents of a city that are happy, which means that they have access to their rights and economic opportunities, learning opportunities, their basic rights are met, they have housing, these sorts of things. But I mean, it's a typical thing of you do a Google search of smart cities, and in the image search, not one of the images has a person in it. And so what we're trying to do is build a dialogue around smart governance and how, maybe the smart cities term has been captured, and maybe there's a lot around the idea of a city's approach should be around governance and understanding the use of information, data, and mechanisms for building smart governance, of which I think we have some leading examples in South Africa. And some really encouraging work. So I think, there's a lot of other things that are going on. We tend to be an organization that has continued to grow, and as such, we typically take on a lot of work. and been really involved with some amazing partners, and are still involved with some amazing partners. I think, as you can see from our approach, that we typically like to work in collaboration or in partnership. We like to build others' kingdoms while they build ours, in a sense. So we're not out there to um, dominate the space. What we want to do is find spaces where our particular collection of skills and expertise, data science, civic technology, uh, action research, design and engagement around public interest and public support for democracy and information and data access plugs in well. So in each of our collaborations, it's about trying to understand the mix and where we can support something that can sustain potentially. Looking for areas where the impact can be maximized or bigger than some of its parts. That's some of the stuff we do.
Some of the stuff you do. It's an impressive lineup of work and projects that you're currently involved in. There seems to be a general fear of data within many public departments. How can we positively address that challenge?
Education is the first and biggest answer always. I mean, it's, I'll point you to the toolkit that we created, which has a lot of these reasons why there's fear around data. I think in the most general form, it's around the capacity and literacy of officials in terms of data. And it's not to say with any arrogance or being accusatory. I think what's been very useful to find as we're part of this global community is that this situation exists in the US and in the UK and in Europe and in Asia and South America. We have these forums and groups we're part of where we all talk about the challenges with data. And it's no different in Canada as it is to South Africa, which is typically that government is under-resourced, that officials are typically over, as a result, have too much work to do. We've got to the point in South Africa where we've corporatized, I think, to our to a fault, and that means that many of our officials in their domains and subject matter expertise become project managers as opposed to implementers, and outsourcing government or development in a lot of ways, which I think is not very good. And I think that's led to an erosion of skills, and also it hasn't forced government departments to build capacity for implementation, and that typically has the specific skills around data. There are some and very significant exceptions to this in the work we do. We find a lot of areas where we're learning and we're kind of led by cities. But I think in general, if you want to generalize it, it's the fear comes up to a lack of knowledge about what data can do or what's possible. Fear around, in the current state of government, it doesn't make sense to take risks. Government is typically not very happy with risk, and changing or innovating in terms of digital data or civic or tech does take leadership and risk. I think leadership in cities is a huge thing. So where you find context of leaders that are able to see the future better, that have a better vision for the city, you typically find departments and people that are more comfortable with data. But I think there is a leadership crisis in many cities in the continent, and many cities in the country. And as a result, the city's not all putting together in one direction. And it makes more sense for officials to keep their heads down and do the work they have rather than trying to embrace new things. I think that there's a lot of things, there's a fear of, especially within South Africa and the history we have, and the challenge that government took on 25 or so years ago, 26 years ago now, when we came to democracy was to inherit a backlog. And since then, the public and civil society and business engagement with government has typically been quite antagonistic. And I think that's built a culture of trying to make sure that everything's perfect before it's public, which never really works, as we know. But I think that, one of the things around data is that the city, any organization, when it looks at, under the rug, it knows there's issues with its information, with its data. What we see significantly in places where there's good innovation and good trust between public and government, and typically then good data environments, is where this is embraced, and everything is brought out into space where it can be improved on. The ideas around open source or around public contribution and how that can maximize investment from government. I think currently in a lot of our contexts, there's still just a fear of what will happen when the data will get out. There's been quite a lot of recent fear with, I think, what is generally a confusion between things like private information, POPI, and PIA, so public access to information. People tend to put those opposite to each other, which I think is completely wrong. But essentially, when you talk about data sharing, or data access, there's typically the argument comes up around POPI and PIA. And I don't think I think those are completely in support of each other. I think that they're part of what's called responsible data. So there's a great organization called the Engines Room, which has put together a responsible data toolkit. And I think within there, it's, a responsibility of government to keep private what should be private, missile codes, individuals' HIV statuses, these sorts of things. But open what could be opened, and what can be opened, and what should be opened. So things that are required for accountability, things that could spark development and innovation. So I think that there's a lot there. I think there's also a lot of use, like when we hear lots is that no one would understand the data. So the public or citizens aren't educated enough, which speaks to a whole lot of problems. I mean, one, that's quite an arrogant approach. But two, the point about sharing data, and I think this is where the demand comes in, and this is where the education comes in, is that, the point is, don't just share information without context. Create the proper mechanisms to have metadata to help people know how to use it, the right licenses. I think also in some cases, government is selling data that should probably be public. It should definitely be public. And we have a strange sort of sub-data market between governments and the private sector. So I think that's not that it's always wrong, but certainly that when you start to create like that first tier of information, you put a price gate in front of it, or pay gate in front of it, you're literally embedding economic inequality, which is typically still along the lines of spatial and social and economic segregation from apartheid. So I think like we'll be very careful, some of the embedded practices that have been normalized around data, So I think there's a lot of reasons why people are afraid of data. Typically we don't like to be antagonistic about it. Our approach is that I think you find enough champions, enough expertise. As I said, certainly in many cases, stuff that we learn a lot from, where you can build momentum behind, and positive examples where the use of data can be shown to have net benefits. And I do think it's changing. I think I think 5 years ago, some of the things I was saying were much stronger. I think that today, especially talking within South African context, I think there's a general acceptance of a lot of these things, or at least starting to be. I think that also cities have been burnt a lot by corporates coming in and selling them a smart cities TM solution, and then 5 years later they're in the same place they were. because certainly I don't think that and now this is not to say, I mean, I don't think any of this data access and smart governance and other thing, it's not possible without corporates in the mix, the big corporates in the mix. I just think that the perspective needs to be that government has to own this, the path and determine the path. So when you start to see corporates approaching government with technical experts and creating curated solutions specifically for that city's context, that's when the city is actually going to start to get smarter, while they're still, buying off-the-shelf solutions for things that are generalized. I think that it's why it can't work, because government, especially government in South Africa, is very specific context and very unique.
On the topic of siloed operations and breaking down siloed operations, how can private and public sector better collaborate on the topic of open data?
I think there's huge opportunities. Once again, once we move past the concept that data is the new oil, to the sense that the use of data, the momentum, the connection, the collaboration around the data industry is actually what will spark real growth and development. I think that there's huge opportunity for ways in which different mechanisms can be set up to help inform decision making. I mean, ultimately, you've got to think about what the goals are between public and private, and if they are informed decision making, if they're economic opportunity, if they're building of democracy, then I don't think that there's much that needs to be, different between public and private. And obviously, private is interesting. I mean, there's business and civil society and academia and others. Maybe they fit in public, but I'd say, like, for example, this emergence of data trusts and mechanisms of which there's been some public issues, like Sidewalk, Toronto, and others. But I think if that model is able to be gotten right, where public and private data is able to be joined in a space that respects all the privacy and security of the data needed, but that aggregate views are able to be pulled by private sector from public information, and from the public sector from private information, without either having access to raw data. I think that's a huge opportunity. I also think that it's really in the private sector's interests to start to meet governments as meet the public sector as a unique consumer. And so stop trying to sell rote solutions, but trying to understand the needs and build in a way that will support them. I also just think that this opens up a huge amount of opportunity for SMEs around, customization, education, literacy, implement of pilots, building of extension pieces of technology that use data. I think there's opportunity for civil society there, as well as for universities to really expand out. But fundamentally, I think this needs to all happen within the context that a city has a data policy, that it has an understanding of its data and the rights around it, that it's got its priorities straight around the development goals, citizens having more access to rights, more services, more informed, inclusive development, smart growth. When it gets those metrics right, and it builds policies and plans around that, it means the private sector can come in and support those. I think without that, what happens is that there's a lot of leakage, or there's a lot of things happening in black boxes, work being done that will never be shared in terms of learning or infrastructure or anything with the city. And so it's sort of stuck there to be rebought again every 5 years or whatever it is, or continue to pay a license fee. And again, not that I'm against, corporate models around, around public-private collaboration around data. I just think that the terms need to change, and the nature of the engagements need to change to be led by an informed buyer, which government needs to be. then I think it's huge. And then I think also, especially within South Africa, but I would say this is probably true across the continent, that the private sector has more of a responsibility around education of data, around data and data literacy, more investments that could be happening. Maybe that's a controversial view, but I think that it's not going to change unless we start to get everyone working together. So again, less of an us and them, and maybe more collaborative, especially education literacy. I mean, I think the biggest thing I care about is not building technology. It's not even the data for data's sake. It's capacity and education and literacy. If we can get those right across the board, I think that there will be the biggest impact.
How do you see cities change, if at all, over the next 5 years? And I guess we can kind of take a post-pandemic outlook.
Yeah, sure. I think in terms of the future of South African and African cities, I think they will be informed by the pandemic. So I think that some of the challenges or opportunities for cities are going to be remote situations. So what does a city start to become when more things can happen remote? Even now, again, like thinking along positive and negative sides, the digital divide and the fact that for a lot of the pandemic, government became remote to a large degree. And so your level of access to data, cell phone credit and the internet, and so public access, I think public access still remains one of the biggest things that is going to define the future of cities. We're talking about the fourth industrial revolution when we haven't got the third industrial revolution right, which means that we're just building, we're stacking up innovation on a small base, and we're furthering inequality and furthering the digital divide. So if we get public access, digital access right, if we get internet access right, then I think the future of cities is going to be very different in terms of inclusion and access to rights and economic development and all those sorts of things, to then if we don't, we perpetuate sort of the divide. I think that there's going to be, and then we're seeing this right now in the context of WhatsApp's new policy with people leaving. I would like to believe, and I'm not sure if it's the case, but every new industry and every new sector goes through a time when it's the Wild West. And in terms of data, in the last 10 years, it's been the Wild West. Big, companies like Google and Facebook and others have had a fairly unregulated and misunderstood or not known ability to use data. And it's interesting to me that, I think what we'll be dealing with as cities is a growing education and understanding of privacy and of data use. And I'm seeing, Tim Berners-Lee and others, startups around my data, being able to control being able to control their own data and who has access to it, who can, have economic use of it and public use of it. And I mean, if that, goes to a city sense, maybe not in 5 years, but I think what's coming is a sense that people will be way more informed of what their data is and who can use it, which may make things either a huge opportunity or a big challenge for cities that need to use data for better development, better planning, better implementation of services. So I think that there will be that's something. I think that something that's huge for cities, and again, like where they will be is really based on leadership. And so, being able to sort of map that future is tough. I really like, so there's a great lab recently called Future Overflow, which is run by Hybrid City Lab in Berlin. Actually, someone I think might be interesting for you to chat to. They had these sort of theses around the future of cities. And it really for me comes down to the level to which there's evolution and revolution. And so the level to which the citizens themselves in cities take ownership and decide what they want to do with cities. And we're seeing this for positive and negative in the States and other places, as well as evolution, which will happen through leadership and building of capacity within government or not. You know, I think there is an opportunity to really leverage the public, the citizens themselves, in a way that benefits both, government and citizens in cities. So to build, physical and digital spaces that are collaborative, and there's public curation happening. I mean, there's some really good platforms that have come out, like Decide Madrid and others, where we're starting to see cities like Barcelona, Madrid and others in South America give citizens huge ability to take part in public procurement of development of public facilities, and really move along the lines of democracy to more deliberative and more real democracy in terms of decision making. I also think in terms of African cities, we have the reality of needing to still deal with the context we have. So the next 5 years, what's not going to change is economic migrants, influx, and urbanization. What's not going to change is the state of the economy. I think we're going to have challenges around post-pandemic recovery. And so for that, I think it speaks more to like will government, more city governments leverage what, and try to do everything themselves, in which case I think they'll fail. Or will they try to leverage like private investment, citizen involvement, civil society and academic support to build out, cities that are more resilient? And I hate that word because it's overused, but the point remains is that it's about being robust and being able to adapt to and adaptable, to whether it's climate situations, health crises, or economic crises, I think. And then, what I am interested to see in a political sense in terms of African cities is the extent to which historically centralized governments become more and more dependent on urban spaces, and city governments become more powerful. So I think the 2016 municipal election was really interesting, in that I think more than ever it was a power, it was a power base of political parties. It started to show how urban voters and the rate of urbanization in South Africa, so I'm talking about South Africa now, had a say in national politics. This year, it's going to be interesting again. I mean, interesting to see from that growth. It's going to be interesting to see from a sense of how cities have dealt with the pandemic and whether that makes a difference. And maybe this is anecdotal, my own views, but I do think that, and I hope we start to see citizens voting less along party lines and more along understanding who they're voting for, what their councillors will do, what their city government has been doing. They're more aware of how to hold them to account or demand from them. And in general, I'll be interested to see, again, over the next 5 years, if cities continue to become more and more powerful in the political sense. And finally, I really hope that our learning has been that we can't do it alone. So what if we don't have as cities necessarily the ability to draw so much on provincial or national support? Can we start to form city collaborations, city coalitions, the ability to learn from each other? And I think that also lines with sort of open data usage, open development of digital and tech, is that, should we continue to, is everyone really on their own to sort of redevelop and reinvent the wheel all the time, or can we start to help with policies and mechanisms and learnings across cities, across the continent? Certainly, the Open Cities Lab is very keen to make sure that the lessons that are learned in one space are able to be used in others, and that we're not, just redoing work. So how much can we build, you know, public knowledge exchange forums, connecting civil society groups, so connecting citizen groups, connecting government,